and welcome to Global Ideas. This is an initiative by Hong Kong Baptist University to bring some of the finest minds together to help us understand some of the complex challenges of our times. Now, this is Global Ideas Season 2. In Season 1, we explored what is called the New Cold War or Cold War 2.0. And in that, our focus had been this wider contest between the USA and China. In this season, we are exploring what is called the deglobalization of global media. And we want to understand whether there is this deglobalization actually happening. Or as someone said, that deglobalization is the ultimate fake story because we are living in a hyper-connected world where trade and tech ties are increasingly growing. Remember, we are also coming to you at a time when some of the most powerful economies in the world are reeling under the impact of a global pandemic. There is a war going on in Europe, and there is also a growing emphasis in the developing world over localization of internet, localization of media, localization of narratives. And of course, politics is also dominated by hyper-nationalist narratives. So how do we make sense of all of this? To make us understand, we are extremely delighted to be joined by an eminent personality all the way from London. We have with us Professor Suzanne Franks. Professor Suzanne Franks is a former BBC TV News and current affairs journalist who worked on flagship programs such as Panorama and Newsnight. She has been the Director of Research at the Center for Journalism in the University of Kent. And in 2012, she took up a professorship at City University of London. She has also served as the head of the City University Journalism Department, which is the oldest and the largest in the UK. She continues to teach and research there and has also held visiting positions at the Reuters Institute in Oxford and the Journalism School in Berkeley. Professor Franks is globally known for her expertise in media and development, women and the media, the coverage of humanitarian disasters, the relationship between media and aid, political communication, and most crucially for the discussion today, the history of the BBC. Professor Franks, welcome to Global Ideas. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Very nice to be here. Thank you.
We also have with us Professor Daya Thussu. Professor Thussu is a renowned global scholar of international communication. He is widely known for his extensive publications in the field of communication. He is the founder and managing editor of the SAGE journal, Global Media and Communications. He has authored or edited 20 books. We are still waiting for the 21st, Professor Thussu. Professor Thussu has been a distinguished visiting professor and inaugural Disney chair at Schwarzman College, Tsinghua University in Beijing, and currently teaches at Hong Kong Baptist University. Professor Thussu, welcome to Global Ideas.
Thank you.
And we also have Mr. Vincent Wong with us. Mr. Wong is a former bureaucrat, currently doing his PhD at HKBU. He has 25 years of industry experience and is a pioneer in promoting solution journalism in Asia. He has an MBA and LLB from the University of Cambridge and Imperial College in London. As usual, Vincent, a pleasure to have you with us.
Hi.
Welcome.
Good to be here. Thank you, Anilesh.
All right, so we go to our guest in London. We have Professor Suzanne Franks. Let me start by asking Professor Franks, I was looking at so many definitions because there are so many definitions of deglobalization. And one of them, which really struck me, was by a professor from Vienna School of International Studies who says deglobalization is a movement towards a less connected world. And I was wondering whether this is really a concerted, a coordinated movement. So first of all, do you think this is a movement? And the other part of the question is deglobalization happening at all? And then in terms of media and communication, is there an emphasis on localization of media? Is there an emphasis on deglobalization of global media? Over to you, Professor Franks.
Well, firstly, thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm delighted to be with you here today to discuss this really, really important phenomenon. So the way I would frame it is that, we still live in a very globalized world, and every day we see this sort of hyper connectivity in so many ways. I mean, the very fact of this, the nature of the program that you're putting on today is just just an effect of that. But at the same time, we live in an increasingly fragmented media environment. I think that's the issue, that the possibilities are now that you can sort of customize, fragment, and lead to this what is often called glocalization, that you're able to listen to a very, very narrow narrative, be it of your own identity group, your own sort of regional interests or whatever. And I think that's the issue, that there's fewer and fewer opportunities, particularly in the news environment, for shared spaces, shared public spaces, shared understanding of facts. So I think that's really what's going on. I don't think there's a concerted movement of localizing, but I think that there's more and more potential and opportunity for fragmentation, and then you get multiple splinters listening to their own groups and enjoying their own media, which is great in some ways, but it also means that there's much less of a sort of shared public understanding of news, and that of course is what the BBC has really given us over this past 100 years.
All right, we will come to the BBC part. Vincent, go ahead.
Yeah.
I think, can I ask follow-up questions on this one?
Sure.
As a media person, I'm always skeptical about these buzzwords like deglobalization, because as a matter of fact, like even when two hostile countries are arguing or there's a trade war, we actually see the movements of people, capital, or even goods still continue, in some cases even grow. So what's your view on that? Is it just a political slogan, or is it try to sway voters? Why does this word even exist in the first place? And why does it become more popular over the past few years or even in the future?
Well, no, I mean, I agree with you to some extent. I think using these buzzwords is sometimes not terribly helpful, because there's so many contradictory things all going on at the same time, and it's a bit sloppy to just think you can sort of capture it all in that sort of way. But I do think, and I agree with you that we still the sort of movements of capital and ideas and connectivity is still very much sort of motoring on. But I'm going back to what I was saying before. I think that the point is that there's this very much this emphasis towards fragmenting of media. The fact that media is now on demand. There's not a kind of shared schedule and a shared understanding and a shared international broadcaster that's taken, or media platforms that are taken as the gospel, and that we all agree on. And I think that's the issue, and I think that's what this is trying to capture. This word, it's trying to capture the sort of fragmenting of media and the fragmenting of communities, all wanting their own narratives, and to a certain extent, using another buzzword, their own sort of echo chambers, which is a worrying phenomenon.
So in other words, more difficult to come up with a consensus among different countries and nations.
Well, a consensus, even within societies. I mean, look at the United States. The degree of polarization expressed through the media, and as a result of the sort of media consumption, is quite frightening. That communities only listen to their own media. They aren't interested in any kind of shared space or shared understanding, and that's extremely bad for democratic democratic understanding and democratic values.
True.
Now we'd like to bring Professor Thussu in here at this point in time. Professor Thussu, would you like to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. I had to use these because there is some construction work going upstairs or downstairs, so I didn't want to have that noise. Before I go to talk about BBC, because BBC is the quintessentially global media organization. If you're talking about deglobalization of media, we need to think about what is BBC doing about it, and But before that, I wanted to say a few things about this idea of globalization itself. Although in general academic or policy discourse or journalistic discourse, it is a phenomena associated with end of the Cold War, opening up of markets, frictionless capitalism, as Bill Gates called it. But there's a much older story. Famously, a book was published some decades ago now, maybe 90s, or was it late 90s? I can't remember. 98, I think it was. Which talked about telegraph as the Victorian internet, right? By an economist, journalist who works for The Economist. So, it's not new. Global trade, technical exchanges, power contestations, nothing new. I think one aspect which we perhaps should take into account when we look at deglobalization is also the phases of globalization. So if we think of 1990s, everything is opening up, new territories are being incorporated into neoliberal capitalism. And then 2008 happens. And suddenly people are rethinking about, can we depend so much on vagaries of US, home insurance, for example. And it is no coincidence that institutions like BRICS emerged at that time, right? And then now in 2020 onwards, you have this COVID, and you have a very different reconfiguration of powers, decoupling, whatever you want to call it. And that has then given this impetus to the idea that globalization, as we understood it for last 3 decades, has come to end and something else is happening. Right? So I think that's really important to contextualize it in. It's not just a buzzword. Of course, it's been used for, in journalistic writing and some academic writing too. But there is a kind of argument about why we are talking about deglobalization now. That's just by way of preface. But the question I wanted to ask Suzanne, and it's so nice to see you. We were supposed to be in a panel together in Akria, but unfortunately I couldn't make it. Among your extensive amount of work and professional work that you have done, BBC, of course, is arguably most important, because it was there, and also you've written about various aspects of global media. You also worked in various different, is it right? You were in India also at some point for the BBC?
Yes. I was in India for a while. Yeah.
And you've worked on Africa also.
Yeah.
So when we talk about global media, there isn't a better example than the BBC. It's been global almost from its inception. Empire Service was established way back in the 1930s. But there's also a certain criticism that goes with that, both domestically in terms of, the Tories don't like the BBC for its liberal bias. The left people do not like the BBC. They think it's too traditional, too elitist, right? And internationally also, it is often seen as and I had a phrase in the book I wrote many years ago. I called it, propaganda in gentlemanly tones. Why is it different from American media? It's more subtle and more sophisticated, but actually essentially doing the same thing. So how do you react to that kind of a criticism that the BBC has, one could argue that, if this is being criticized by the left and the right, it must be doing something right, because both sides dislike it. And it's also the case that in terms of its global presence and influence, it remains, even in this time of extremely crowded media ecology, probably the most credible international news organization, certainly most credible broadcaster. So how do you react to the criticism, more in the global context? Of course, you could refer to the domestic aspect too. I think it's particularly significant because we are celebrating the 100 years of BBC's founding, and it has created precedents for other broadcasters, public broadcasters around the world.
Well, and I think you're obviously right that the BBC is certainly not perfect, and it has also received some fair criticism and some unfair criticism over these past 100 years. I mean, firstly, I'll talk about in a domestic context. Having a public broadcaster, which is really different from, people don't understand this, it's different from a state broadcaster, means that we all feel we're part of it. We all feel we own it, and that it has to serve all of the public. And that also makes for a very intense relationship. And that there is, every day there's sort of criticism about whether the BBC is serving communities properly, whether it's reflecting too much of the left or the right, or as you said. Just an hour ago, I was listening to an item, for example, about regional accents in the BBC News, and that the BBC doesn't properly reflect our regional accents, and it's too snobbish and just wants the received pronunciation. So it is very much at the sort of heart of this the public sphere in here in the UK, where we all pay for it through license fees. So I think that's it. It's almost that it's we call it auntie because it is almost part of the family, and that's the relationship that the public often feels with it. But looking much broader and looking internationally, I think that's much more complicated, and that has changed a lot over the years. I mean, you're right, the BBC was set up in the 1930s as the Empire Service. And if we listen to now, or you read some of the scripts from that time, it's pretty shocking the way that it's sort of attitudes and the way it comes over as this sort of very, very staid colonial broadcaster, sort of broadcasting to its dominions overseas. But I do think that as there's more and more noise, which you referred to, and competition, and lots now of international broadcasters. There's not just the BBC World Service, which there was for many years, and various sort of rather less well funded and less respected American channels and so on. I do think that the values that the BBC has tried to stand for and has tried to sort of craft over these years have become more and more significant, and by many communities valued more and more. The idea that this is a public broadcaster, it's not the state, it's not the British state views, and there's often big fights, as you well know, between the state and the BBC, and that it is telling people what they don't necessarily want to hear, but it is telling the truth, and it has, on any measure of trust now, it is the most trusted disseminator of news. And I think that's the key thing, isn't it? How trusted are you by audiences? And the BBC is still very, very trusted. There's many arguments saying that it is still a form of propaganda, but I think in comparison to anything else, to the hundreds and hundreds of international news channels that there are now, it still does bring something special and of value, which is this notion of being trusted by audiences to tell the truth.
Right. Thank you for that. One of the areas where international television news media, which remains still very influential, I would argue. It may be consumed in a different way. People might be looking at it on their mobile phones, but they're watching a Reuters, television story, or they're watching CNN or BBC or RT or whatever it is. But visuals are very important, and they gain extra importance at the time of a crisis, a conflict situation, for instance. And again, BBC has a very long history of covering wars and conflict. And as you know, during the Second World War, the German establishment was listening to BBC broadcasters radio to compare what was actually happening on the battlefield, rather than depending on their own propaganda machinery, which was again very sophisticated. I mean, their propaganda machinery, and very well resourced. So if we look at what's happening in Ukraine today, actually since February 2022, some might say even 2014, how do you see the coverage of the BBC? Because where I'm located now in Hong Kong, I'm looking at it from a slightly different perspective. And well, I would have done that in London anyway, but that's irrelevant. But I'm saying there's a different position in the sense that, there is another narrative of what's happening in Ukraine, which you don't see that often highlighted in the mainstream coverage of the BBC. And not just the BBC, generally dominant Western mainstream media. Do you see that as an issue, that there is a kind of the tone and the tenor and the emphasis And it becomes particularly striking when you contrast that with what has been happening in Ethiopia at around the same time, where many more people have died. I mean, we're talking about 500,000 people. And the coverage is, I mean, I don't want to emphasize that point. It's not everyday news item. So how do you explain that, in the sense also that it is a European war essentially, and a large part of the world is actually taking a more nuanced, a more neutral position, as we have seen in the way governments have responded to UN for resolutions on Ukraine, for example. So do you see that perhaps an issue here that BBC is following is certain agenda, which may be, as I said before, presented in a very gentlemanly way, but essentially is not very different from what a US-led network would be representing?
Well, there's a lot to cover there. Very interesting questions. May I go back first of all to I'd quite like to sort of touch on what you started with, talking about the Second World War and as a sort of context. The reason that the BBC took a particular line in the Second World War is that if you look back, I know there wasn't a BBC during the First World War, but there was a media coverage in the newspapers. Yeah. And there was huge criticism at the end of the First World War that the public hadn't been told the truth. If you look at the media reporting of the First World War, it's all kind of gung-ho, we're all doing wonderfully, and sort of let's jolly on the troops and win these battles. And that became very, very contested after the war, and that was seen that the media had done a shocking job. And it was quite interesting that if you're looking at the First World War now, it's much more that we turn to the poetry and the literature of the First World War to actually tell the truth about what was going on. And there were some, still today, we all the time you hear reference to this remarkable literature of the First World War, because the media was doing, which I believe partly flowered because the media was doing such a terrible job. So if you come to the Second World War, the start of the Second World War, the BBC reporting was not, I mean, I'm looking at the first period in the end of 1939, the reporting was not particularly good. They weren't really telling the full story. It was a pretty sort of, limited narrative. And then something changed in 1940 when things got worse and worse, as they did, and Britain was on the brink of being invaded, and it looked as if things were, this was all going to end a terrible disaster. The BBC changed its position and decided that actually telling people the truth about what was going on, dreadful as it was actually doing a much greater service, and would lead to greater trust and greater sort of community understanding, I suppose, and possibly, and paradoxically, knowing the bad news was actually better for morale. And there's a quite a good phrase, which is telling the truth became more important than consolation at that period. That just consoling the audiences and telling them it was all going to be fine actually wasn't doing any kind of service, but telling them the truth. And this is what the reporting of the Second World War was. It was a lot. There was a lot of bad news. Well, particularly in 1940, there was a lot of bad news. As Dunkirk fell and the British retreated back across the Channel in little boats, the BBC started to tell the truth, and then began to realize that actually audiences really respect that. They really trust that. And that is why across Europe, it's not just the German High Command, but people were listening to the BBC. A lot of them, and in huge danger. I mean, there was a death penalty for owning a radio set and listening to the BBC across Europe at that point. But it was so trusted because it told the truth that people were willing to risk their lives. So, and I suppose what I'm trying to say is that developing this trust again and on audience trust in times of crisis is seen as became a more and more important value. But turning to the present day, I first of all want to address the point which Daya, which you raised about, which crises do we report? And as you probably know, I've written a lot about this, going right back to the
that's
to the
why
1990s.
I'm asking you this, because I know you're written about it. Yes.
Yeah. No, I mean, it is still extraordinary to me that kind of if you sit there, if you arrived from Mars and looked at what was happening on our planet now, and what is the most deadly wars, where people are suffering the most, you wouldn't use the news values necessarily that we see again and again, and there are lots and lots of reasons for that, and all the kind of the whole literature about news values and why we report certain things and we ignore other things, which is I and others have written about in many areas. So yes, I mean I do personally find it very, very troubling that we have this terrible situation in Tigray and Ethiopia, and that isn't being given the kind of coverage that it should. So I want to say, because you report the wars that are closer to home, you report the wars that your country is involved in, and that because Britain is pretty involved in Ukraine. We're training Ukrainian soldiers here. We're sending arms, and we have lots and many Ukrainian refugees in the UK. So there is an element of what Gulf and Rouge and so on and many others call proximity. So that I think you're right that that there is always this need for balance, for understanding what else is going on. But actually, paradoxically, when we had the ridiculous shenanigans that we've had in our own domestic politics over the last few weeks, it became hard to even find news of Ukraine. I mean, I was sort of hunting around to find out what was going on in Ukraine. And in Iran as well, as the airways were just completely crowded with whoever was our new prime minister and who'd and
how long he or she would stay, right? How long he or she would stay.
Yeah. So actually that because I do remember sort of because some of these there were some big developments in September in late September in Ukraine, but I suppose also the Queen died as well. So there is always a worry about news values and what's being reported. But you're absolutely right that this is the biggest European war since 1945, and it has been something that has consumed our attention in terms of international news, and that is not always a good thing. But I would say that when you talk about the actual narrative of the war, I suppose what you're saying is that there is a kind of a more neutral and possibly even pro-Putin angle to this, and the number. If you look at the sheer numbers of countries represented in the United Nations votes, you're right that there wasn't an overwhelming majority for condemning Putin. But I think there are a lot of reasons for that as well, aren't there? There are a lot of countries that don't necessarily want to, I mean, in Africa, for example, which I know about more, a lot of countries that don't want to upset Russia. So I think you've got to tell that story as well. And in defense of the reporting, I mean, the one thing that strikes me particularly is that I think the BBC does an extremely good job of reporting from Russia. I mean, they have a very, very good Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg, and if you follow what he does, you do understand a lot about what's going on inside Russia and what the pressures are there and what's happening to people and communities in Russia. So that I think gives you another dimension, which I don't see in some of the I don't think the American media do anything like that in terms of really understanding what's going on inside Russia. And yes, I think that there is obviously, there's a bias towards, there is sort of great hostility towards Russia and Putin, but I don't know. I mean, I don't really feel that that's sort of, I do feel one hears the other side, one hears the kind of anti-NATO narrative in a way that makes you understand what's going, what's going on in other parts of the world and looking at Ukraine. But I do think that the sort of also the kind of the range of coverage, and that we get huge amount of coverage from individuals inside local reporting inside Ukraine. I do think that again gives us some kind of insights which you probably don't get from a more sort of polished, and also a more kind of what I always feel the sort of American coverage of these sorts of situations is so much more of this kind of fireman reporting, just zooming in, telling the story, and then zooming off to the next crisis. I do think that because the BBC has had all the language services over the decades, they have people who've been based in Ukraine for many years who broadcast to the language, the world service and the language services, and there I think you get a sort of nuance and an expertise that you don't get from a broadcaster that's just sort of, although it's very well resourced, is just sort of flying in, telling a story and then flying out again.
Right. So, but back to the deglobalization, because we are definitely not here to put BBC into the dock, and certainly not you are the spokesperson for the BBC, so it should not sound like that. No. I remember all the documentaries of John Sweeney. I used to follow him a lot, and once he was nearly arrested in Russia, and that's how we got to know how the inner machinery works. But moving on from BBC to the globalization topic, which is the main theme of the discussion. Vincent, go ahead.
Yes, I think it's quite interesting you compare the present time with World War I, and I think back then, global organization are much weaker compared to what happens after World War II. And I think deglobalization has often been attributed to how strong or how important are the international institute. Can the same thing apply today in the media industry? Are the global media, particularly the Western ones, are in decline? Are more people trusting them, or the way of doing news are simply different? That's why the whole global media industry has lost their charm or lost their influence.
Well, I think that's the problem, isn't it? That when you talk about global media, you're talking about all sorts of other kind of what Daya was refers to as sort of infotainment. I mean, the global media don't make their money out of news. They make their money out of lots of other content, and I think news has to struggle again and again because news is expensive. It's very expensive to do news well. And the global media platforms just prefer to hoover up what everybody else is doing, aggregate it, and put it out, rather than actually having boots on the ground, going out and finding out what's going on. So I think that the position of news within global media, trusted, expensive, reliable news, is fragile, and I think that's more and more worrying, because I think we have a generation coming now. I'm not talking about the students that you teach or I teach, who probably have a more sophisticated understanding of this, but we have a rising generation who don't understand that you pay for news, that news is something expensive, and I think that's very worrying, because you then have an elite that is willing to pay for news and understand the value of high quality information, and you have the vast mass of a population that just see news as a sort of extension of entertainment, and it's something that's just sort of served up in a sort of aggregated form for free.
Okay, so taking further from Vincent left, not just the infotainment angle, but going to the pure news itself. Do you think that, so for example, we can take the example of the coverage of pandemic. So the crisis, say in the US, covered by the US media, or the crisis, say in the China, covered by US media, the crisis in India covered by US media, was completely different. So going back to the question, do you think that the once upon a time really reliable, these giants like the BBC and CNN, which used to have a lot of weightage around the world, do you think that partly also the way we saw the coverage of the pandemic, that they are on a decline in some ways? Do you think that people are increasingly going towards their own media rather than looking at how the US media was talking about what the governments were doing in their own countries. So, for example, a US government will say that, okay, the Indian government is completely inefficient, or the Chinese are completely inefficient in handling the pandemic, whereas there was dead bodies piling up in New York. So do you think that, do you get a sense that, okay, the rise of the regional media in some of the most important economics, albeit developing, is somewhere challenging the narratives that have been there for so long, created by the Western world? Do you think that's happening at all? Or do you think it's like overestimation?
Well, I mean, it depends. It depends where you look. I mean, this is a huge debate. I mean, if we go right back to when Al Jazeera started, I think Al Jazeera did bring a sort of fresh perspective and show that there was a different narrative for telling international news, and that's I'm not so convinced they're doing such a great job today, but I think that really was something very, very new on the scene to show that this kind of dominant Western, particularly American narrative wasn't necessarily the best way. I mean, the problem I always find is that when you sit in America and watch their news, it is so parochial and so ill-informed generally about the rest of the world that it's quite extraordinary. I mean, there's so little interest really in what's going on outside, and a lot of the reporting, you're right, is pretty cliched and pretty limited. So that the regional media has got a great space to fill to tell a better and a more nuanced and a more angled version. But I mean, we could go on to this, but I think some of the local media also has its own issues. I mean, the news. I mean, Daya knows much more about this, but the quality of news reporting in India is suffering at the moment, and has sort of there's sort of dangerous things going on there. And likewise, I'm not sure that I would turn to the Chinese media to give me a full and comprehensive view of what was going on during the pandemic.
Would that lead to a deglobalization or de-Americanization of the internet? Because we used to think the internet is one space, like one public forum. But there are discussion or even books about, even in the Western world, the internet is going to break into three parts. European is doing their own thing, American is doing more financial, and startup are coming with, why don't we come up with an entirely new platform? Why don't we just scrap the old one and go to the new utopia, right? And then we always have the saying that we have the internet, and then we have the Chinese internet, right? So at least we are seeing 4 internets or even more. So is that the deglobalization of the internet?
Yes, I suppose in some senses it is. It's a kind of fragmentation of the internet, and it's being sort of partly framed through sort of political wishes in order to sort of craft something that works in an individual space. Yeah. I mean, I think this sort of global vision is now become rather contorted from, compared to the way it was envisaged originally. Absolutely. And also the way that the individual regimes will then, use it for their own benefit. I mean, if you look in Iran, this sort of switching off, and this happens in other repressive areas, switching off of the internet and deliberately targeting the protest movements and so on is also a symptom of that as well.
Right. Professor Thussu, how do you see this deglobalization through the rise of many internets in the world?
Yes, I mean, as Suzanne said, it's an indication of what is happening to the cyberspace. I mean, the phrase earlier used to describe this phenomena was balkanization of the internet. But now that balkanization is happening within nations, within blocks. I mean, Vincent mentioned the Chinese internet, which is actually the largest internet in the world with its own platforms. So the argument is often made is that especially in the West, that the Chinese system is totally controlled by the party state, which is a factual statement. But some people have argued precisely because it was state-controlled, they were able to develop their own platforms, which no other country, with possible exception of Russia, and Russians are not.
Sorry, I missed that. I missed that, Daya. Develop their own what?
Their own platforms. So they have
their
own version of Twitter, their own version of Google, their own version of Amazon, etc., etc. And given that the market is so massive, it has survived, and there is support from the state. And also it is now being exported outside China, especially in developing countries. So that's an interesting kind of contestation between the open versus closed internet, right? And then within the open internet too, we have obviously had a lot of work, academic work, most notably the idea of the surveillance capitalism. This famous book which came out a couple of years ago, that is, in the freest country in the world, namely the United States, our data has become a commodity. We have become a commodity which is tradable and sold in various cyberspaces. And I think that is also leading to a certain trend towards localization of data. The debates about digital sovereignty, for instance. A lot of that is happening in not just in authoritarian one-party states. For example, in India, there's a big debate currently going on about data sovereignty, and they're spending a lot of money in setting up data centers. They don't want their data to be in China or in Europe or wherever. How do you see this phenomena in terms of the kind of commodification of information, not just news media, and this contestation between two models, the dominant model? And as Vincent said, there is also a European version which is more regulated, public-oriented, etc. But the dominant one, if you look at who are the top platforms in the world, you have to look very hard to find a European platform. Right? They're essentially all American. And they are also now, distributors for news. So if you don't have access to Google or Facebook or, other platforms, you don't know what is trending if you don't have. So it's not just, so BBC cannot survive on its own without having presence in social media. And for a generation that you were referring earlier, who thinks that news is free, they don't have to watch television or read a newspaper. It's what they get on their phone.
Yeah, no, I absolutely. I should have mentioned that earlier. I mean, this whole sort of American emphasis, where it's all just a kind of commercial good, and we ourselves and our attention has become a commercially traded entity, is absolutely worrying, and that's why there was this sort of pushback, certainly in Europe, in order to regulate that and make sure that you can't just have your data traded and used and stolen without your permission. But Americans often don't understand that. I mean, they think the sort of regulations in Europe is all just it is a ridiculous waste of time, that it's all about the sort of free market trading. So that I think that was a response. Definitely a response to the whole sort of surveillance capital narrative, which I think has been very, very sober and a good warning to us all, that just sort of letting yourself be sort of used in the interest of a sort of global advertising phenomenon is very worrying. So yeah, you're absolutely you're yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what the question is really, because I think it's very obvious that we have these sort of different tendencies pulling in different areas, and the model in developing countries is sometimes looking at China and thinking, well, we want that kind of control. We don't want this sort of free for all, either a commercial free for all or a political free for all that you get in a country where the obviously it's all about the First Amendment and capitalism being able to do as it wishes.
So the question really was about whether this trend demonstrates a bigger shift, which is the deglobalization of communication, of trade, of all this part of this tech war which is happening, decoupling, whatever you want to call it. But it seems to be also reflected in narratives. For instance, if you look at, we mentioned Ukraine earlier, this is a very different debate about that in China, for instance, or India, for instance, which is not for their own reasons, or in Turkey, or in Iran, or in even Brazil. So that's what I'm saying. And that debate is not happening so much in the mainstream media. In fact, a lot of it is happening in social media. So these platforms become very important. You know, the algorithms become very important, and therefore it's sort of, you know, if algorithms are controlled by a company in China, then they might promote their own version of events, and then they go. So that's the kind of concern and worry.
Yes, I think that this sort of huge American dominance meant that there was one particular mode, and that is now being challenged. But it's as you said, most of the platforms are still very much Silicon Valley based in the US. So we haven't really seen, I mean, other than China and the way that the Chinese internet is run, we are still, you know, you can go to the middle of Africa and everybody's still, you know, wants to be on Facebook or so on. So I think I think telling different narratives and different local political narratives is one thing, but I think the sort of tech infrastructure is still very much dominated by America, particularly American, certainly not European platforms.
All right, last question, Vincent.
How should we imagine or envision global media organization will look like? How will they change? When we are all talking about this decoupling, there's deglobalization, right? So it's not everybody's moving to the same direction now. Like we are swimming against the current. So there's a deglobalization trend, but we still want to maintain some sort of global media because we still need to have trusted source of news. And then everybody is saying that we should fact check everything, which is worrying because it means that everything can be fake, right? That's why we have to check everything. And I think one of the major missions of the BBC World Services is also like, how can we work with fact-checking organization or to improve people's awareness, media literacy of that sort. So how should we think in terms of management, in terms of not only media management, but as a global trend? What would global media look like in the current wave of deglobalization? Just very vaguely, of course. Say 5 to 10.
My goodness. That is a huge.
It's the last question. The last question is there's open hand. You can think about anything, Professor.
Well, that would be too dangerous to speculate about what the world would look at. But I go back to the trends we've been talking about. I mean, this sort of, you know, increasing fragmentation, where we want to listen to our own communities, and globalization. I think what you've just hinted at, the rise of the fact checker, is extraordinary. I mean, I have a colleague who writes about this and researches it, and it is a remarkable, you know, the idea that you would need to fact check every image that comes out and the way that things are. But I mean, I'm sure you see many of these deep fake videos, you know, going back to the one of Nancy Pelosi drunk and that kind of thing. And when you can do that kind of thing on the media, then you do need to fact check absolutely everything, which is, you know, is an extraordinary, would have seemed extraordinary to us many years ago. But I think that's the kind of media literacy that we need to be teaching now. And I think teaching media literacy and making sure a rising generation, and all generations and older people as well, who don't understand that you can manipulate a video and make it say all sorts of fake things. We all need to be alert to that, and to alert to how media is being used and how we are being manipulated, whether it's our data being stolen, or we're being fed false narratives, or we're being told that, you know, that this is all just, you know, news is just something that comes in the air for free, rather than something that has to be sort of worked at and explained and paid for. I think all, you know, it's up to all of us to understand how media works and how media platforms are developing.
No, and that is our effort through this series, to ensure that people have more information, more education about how the media works, and there's no gospel that comes out from one part of the planet and everybody has to necessarily follow to that. Thank you very much, Professor Suzanne Franks. Thank you very much, Professor Thussu. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Still to be Dr. Vincent, or Vincent for now. Thank you very much for being here.